Well, my name is Fernanda Sobrido, and with Marita Castelló, we founded Conexión Austral. It's a digital magazine from Rio de la Plata. We are from Uruguay and Argentina. We build the magazine. We are building this magazine for connection, to invite leadership from different parts of the world, to rethink, reflect about the well-being in organization and the way that to create bridges between South America and the world, and the global world. And for us, it's a great pleasure to accept this interview. And I thank you very much. Marita, if you.
Okay. So, Richard, thank you so much for sharing this meeting. I'm María Castelló. I'm a neuroscientist based at the Instituto de Investigaciones Biológicas Clemente Estable in Montevideo, Uruguay. And I'm also a counselor from the Educa school here also in Uruguay. And well, we've been thinking about some questions to share with you for this interview. And one of the first things that we would like to ask you to share with us is, along your prolific career, if there was a specific moment in this professional career or personal life that led you to adopt this human-centered, integrative view of the leadership and of organizational change.
I would, by the way, thank you very much for interviewing me. The closest, sorry, I've been around Uruguay, but not in Uruguay, so I apologize. My wife and I have spent time at Iguazu, and
so
and of course visiting our friends in Sao Paulo and Rio, and we spent time in Paraty and Buenos Aires.
Well, next time
you
may you may come closer.
I live in Argentina. I live in Buenos Aires.
You do?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, because my parents are Argentinian, and Argentina and Uruguay as well.
Well, my wife and I spent a week in Buenos Aires because I was giving a speech there for a big world conference a number of years ago. But we also were in Tierra del Fuego when we went to Antarctica. So anyway, so to answer your question, Maria, there are two things. One was a growing discomfort or puzzle, and that wasn't one moment. That was a whole series of things. My parents are immigrants from Greece. My father came over in 1938, having started the university, but immediately took out papers because he came to the US legally, and was drafted. So he spent several years in the jungles of Panama during World War II, and then made it to Normandy Beach and the invasion. He gets out. There's no way he's going to go back into university life because he had met my mother and they'd gotten married. Her parents had immigrated, and then they had gone back to Crete, and then they returned to the US. So he was a waiter, and we lived in a working class neighborhood in Queens, right over the bridge from Manhattan. And I was amazed because there were all these square blocks of immigrants and working class immigrants. So people were waiters or plumbers or firemen, but different things. They worked with their hands by the hour. And I remember noticing that some of the families seemed to do well, and others just didn't. Others got stuck. So at an early age, I started to wonder why some people could change and adapt and other people couldn't. I started to look at people that we would see in the neighborhoods, in the streets, that were alcoholics or drug addicts. There weren't that many drug addicts apparent in those days, in the late 40s, early 50s, but there were enough. And then we had a lot of people who were veterans who had suffered during the war that still had what today would be called PTSD, then was called battle fatigue or shell shock. And that included some family members. Again, puzzled as to how some people could change and others couldn't. I watched, at that point, I would say I wasn't as thoughtful about organizations, but we then moved out to another working class community, and the same thing. People from different ethnicities, immigrants from different countries, some would make it, some wouldn't. And even as I began working, outside the home for to save money for, because at that point I knew I wanted to go to university. I was working in kitchens and those kind of low-level jobs. And again, I was puzzled as to why some people could smile, do their jobs well, get offered promotions, move into management, buy restaurants, and others got stuck fighting with each other with knives. Okay, now flash forward. The New York City school systems decides I'm slow. I spoke with a Greek accent because I spoke Greek before English. I could read Greek letters. I couldn't read English letters. And in 1950, that was considered a sign of retardation, not really multiculturalism. So they tried to lead me back a few times. And my mother fought like hell to, catch me up and put me back into school. And then in 1957, when Sputnik went up, the US went into its probably largest shock since Pearl Harbor, which was how could the Russians beat us into space? So you probably don't know this, but every child in the United States was tested at that point. Every child in every school.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, they found through these tests that I was really good in math and science, in particular physics. So they offered my mother a deal that I could either skip a few grades or I could take an experimental program where we did junior high school and high school and 2 years of college, all in 6 years. My mother knew she assumed I was really smart, but she also knew I was probably a little socially awkward, if not backward. So she opted for the latter. Because of those experiences, it became clear to me, and I'd always been fascinated by space, that I wanted to be in the space program. And what became clear as I was applying to universities was that I wouldn't be allowed to go into space because in those days, in 1962 and 3, you had to have perfect vision. I didn't. So my first choice was MIT, and I went and I got in, and I'm designing space vehicles as I'm being trained to do, and I ran out of money. I mean, I'd saved up money from my music work, and I'd gotten some scholarships. I'd taken out so many loans. Nobody, the federal government or any bank, would lend me any more money. As I said, my parents were supporting me in every psychological way possible, but they couldn't financially. So MIT got me a job doing what I was trained to do, which is to design parts of spaceships for a company called Northrop Norair in Los Angeles. And it was a program they had on their books. Today, we'd call it an internship, but it was fully paid. And the idea was if you went out and did it from August to early or mid-January, you could usually save enough money to then finish the whole degree, which is exactly what happened. But in the process, I discovered that the work, the day-to-day work, was boring. I mean, yes, in 1966, I was specifically working on the portal design for a shuttle. And it had to have features that could go from Earth to the Earth space station, from moon base to the moon space station, and from the Mars base to the Mars space station. So I'm working on all that. It sounds very exciting, but when it comes down to it, you're spending 8 hours a day in a cubicle programming computers. And in those days, we didn't have computer graphics. So I remember spending 2 weeks of my life putting 900 points on a piece of graph paper and then connecting the dots to make a point in this report. 2 weeks of my life. And so I finished that, and they, the company was liked what I was doing, and I went out with a couple of my friends from MIT. They loved what we were doing. They offered us jobs when we graduated. And my two colleagues that were with me didn't take their job, but they took other technical jobs. I went back to MIT and I said, this is it. I mean, I got to change. I don't want to go into restaurants. My father, my uncles, my cousins, everybody on this side of the Atlantic that was Greek that I knew were in restaurants. I didn't want to do that. I did it a few summers. I didn't think my music was that good that I could really make a living. So I said, I'll go into management. It's got to be easy. Look at these idiots we had at Northrop. I mean, I never saw people deal with research departments. With everybody in those two departments was really smart. Even scary smart, what I'd call, because we're all weird. So I sign up. I have only 2 courses that I had to take, technical courses, to finish my degree, and I'm much too compulsive. I did. But I figured, okay, I'd take some electives in management and see if I can get a job in management. So I sign up for this class, and these professors are describing these management courses that don't have prerequisites. And this one young fellow who's finishing a PhD in psychology from Harvard describes a course that to me sounds like utter garbage. It's called organizational psychology. But in his description, he says 2 words that make me run to the basement classroom to get in. And those 2 words were no tests. It turns out later, in my PhD in psychology at Harvard, I was studying personality and I became a therapist, a psychotherapist. But one of the things I discovered was I should have known I'm test phobic. I don't psychologically do well on formal tests. I get very anxious. So both there's the puzzles, that's the human, that's at that point probably more subconscious, not but kind of in that fuzzy area. And then this moment that has nothing to do with the content. And within months, I started working on a project for the course. He offered me some data to use of his own data. He liked it. He offered me a summer job. We published the paper. He got me into PhD courses. All of a sudden, I'm studying with people who I didn't know, because I didn't know the field, were giants in the field. Ed Schein became one of my mentors, and Dave McClellan from Harvard was doing some courses, and other people. And they brought me into this field called psychology that I just loved. See, I never knew somebody who would do what they were doing for work, whether they were paid or not. I mean, everybody I knew, enjoyed their job. Not everybody enjoyed their jobs, but many enjoyed their jobs. But when they could retire, they'd retire and either go back to the old country or, find some way to just relax. All of a sudden, when I discovered psychology, I discovered something that just was amazing. And the part of it that was interesting to me was how people change. Mm-hmm. I wasn't that interested in the other parts. I wasn't interested in why people were crazy. Or mentally disturbed or emotionally, whatever. I was just interested in how do they become better. So when I got into the PhD program in psychology, my focus was on change. But by this point, I paid my way through MIT. And like I said, I had so many debts. And I had to pay my way through Harvard too. Because of my mathematical and science background, they thought I was intriguing as a doctoral student, but not so much that they would pay for me. So I was having to teach and do consulting while I was in the PhD program. And that meant that I was automatically focused on how do individuals change. I was also focused on how do organizations change. And because there were some consulting projects that were opportunities in that era, this was the late 60s, I got involved in community development. So I'm in the PhD program at Harvard studying cultural anthropology, sociology, social psychology, and clinical psychology. But I'm also in my work trying to help people get better at their lives, get better at work. I was doing some work with managers in companies like Monsanto. I was working with ministers in the American Baptists who wanted to be more socially involved. And because my thesis advisor, Dave McClellan, had started a string of research on why men drank abusively and women, but the focus at that point was on men. I had joined him in some of those studies, and an opportunity came up to design a therapy program. And he knew my interests, so he said, "Do you want to do it?" And I said, "Yeah." So by 1970, I had developed a new therapeutic program to add to Alcoholics Anonymous and medical treatment, and that would help people develop better life skills. And the idea was, it was a group therapy program to complement these other forms of treatment. And I was training therapists to do it. And as you probably know, when you train psychotherapists, you actually do therapy with patients, with them together for a number of iterations. And, that's how you do the training. So by the time I finished, I was really focused on how do we help individuals make better lives. I was heavily involved in helping those with addiction problems, but it was very clear to me from this systems perspective, again, multi-levels, that if all we did was got to the individual, they'd be back in drinking 6 months from now or taking drugs. Because by then there were a lot of returning veterans from Vietnam who were pretty messed up. So it became clear that if you wanted to help an individual change in a sustainable way, you had to help the groups or the teams of which they socially were a part of, which means their families and their work groups. But the problem with addiction is very often people, after 10 years or 20 years of being an alcoholic or a drug addict, their families are gone. They don't want to talk to them. And they've lost jobs. There isn't any work. So that became a puzzle. At the same time, just as a way to make some money, I was asked to do some of these projects in companies, not for alcoholics and drug addicts, but for managers and executives who wanted to be better at what they were doing. So, and that was a little bit of a relief because, doing psychotherapy and during 1972 to 77, I think I averaged 18 days of group therapy a month. I was on the road 28 days a month. It's before I got married, because you couldn't be married and even form a relationship with that kind of schedule. But it's very depressing work. So I really, at that point, decided in the late 70s, I would shift my focus to helping people that weren't quite so interrupted in their lives. I don't want to say damaged because that has other connotations, but and that's when the work that I'd started in 1970 on competencies, what we call emotional intelligence today, really became very clear, because now when you're dealing with people without clear problems in their behavior, then you ask the question, change what? And that's when it was very clear, change to help them be more effective. So the whole competency thing got developed. I applied the same principles that Dave Kolb and because he was the professor that first introduced me to this. And meanwhile, he and I continued to do research and publish along the way. And that was in 1967. That was the beginning, the first version of what became my intentional change theory. Sorry, that's more than you wanted to know, but because you asked what moment, it was really a set of things.
Wow.
It's perfect. It's perfect. And
Okay.
thank you so much, Richard, because I mean, this you're sharing moments and things that I feel that are very intimate and
Right.
and we appreciate very much your gratitude, your how do you say
To open.
yeah, to be so open and
Yes.
and
Because
you yeah
something that the two of you would appreciate is you come from essentially Latin cultures,
Mhm.
yes
which are more relationship oriented.
yes
Yes.
That's how I grew up.
yeah
So
yes.
it was very interesting to me. I mean, I did my PhD thesis on a new theory of intimacy because I felt most of the American, British, and European, most of which were German, Austrian, or French, researchers got it wrong. They thought of intimacy as filling a need, a gap.
Mhm.
And I introduced a theoretical distinction with proposed different neurological bases that, yes, it could be. Some people were driven by the anxiety of wanting to be reassured and connected, if you will, attachment issues. But other people found love or a less intense version of it, deep friendship.
Yeah.
And when I proposed that, I remember my thesis advisor, it was, Dave McCullough is one of the biggest names in human motivation in the world. And he said, wow, he said, everybody missed that. And it was because I think everybody was coming out of a cultural perspective in which what you were doing in your head was the highest order of development. That was whole Maslow thing. He was an Austrian immigrant. And he was a part of the Hasidic community, Jewish community, all of which is very intellectual. Well, and even people like Erik Erikson and of course Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, they all focused on the head.
Yeah.
What about love and caring?
Yes.
So I remember saying after I graduated, I was, doing all this other work. And periodically people asked me to go on radio shows, and this is in the early 70s. So I started giving a talk called The Destruction of Intimacy in America. And I was talking about not how divorce was the problem, but how the disruption of the extended family, that when people got divorced or when in America they wanted to get a job, they moved. Well, my family in Greece, my friends in Italy, my friends in other Mediterranean countries, they actually wouldn't go for the better job because they wouldn't want to leave their extended family. So I posed the fact that the real threat wasn't divorce. It was not seeing your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins. If you don't see them on a regular basis, how do you feel connected in life? You search for things, and all of a sudden you become more vulnerable to social pressures.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you
Now,
so much.
decades later, and I was blaming that on the extended family breakup and television. Of course, now it's horrendously worse because of the internet, because of smartphones, and then of course COVID made everybody retreat with their anxieties. So the mental health problems we're now having in just about every country in the world, the work problem, the motivation problems at work are crazy. 80% of the people in every country studied aren't engaged in their work. 50% of the people feel stress over the top every day. And now 30% feel lonely at work. And that number is growing. And we see suicides growing. We see all sorts of other problems. And now we know part of it is neurological, that when people got COVID, if they were hospitalized or had long COVID, so it wasn't just, a day or two of discomfort, they later showed deterioration of white and gray matter in the part of the prefrontal cortex called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Now, that part of the brain, the default mode network, is key to activating both the parasympathetic nervous system, the only antidote to stress, as Naomi Eisenberger has shown over the years, but also, as others have shown, that's the key to relationships. That it's not the mirror neuron network that people thought about, Jacoboni and Rizzolatti in the 90s. It's not that. It's this other part. Well, it turned out that the COVID virus did damage. Now, I believe that there are things that people could do that could rebuild that, to stimulate neurogenesis. And in my fMRI studies, we've shown that feeling hope and feeling compassion were key ways to literally get people into the parasympathetic nervous system. They stimulated neurogenesis, and they could rebuild not just the neurons, but the myelination on the existing neurons. The problem is that if you've suffered from an increase in your neuroses, which almost everyone did during COVID, and you withdrew, you stopped seeing other people, you stopped going outside your home, you stopped interacting with people, it makes it worse. So now the remedies aren't in your grasp. And I'm afraid, and I remember saying even in fall of 20, when sadly people were still dying of COVID, and it was very horrible in that way, but I predicted that the long-term, most serious cost of COVID was going to be the mental and emotional illness born of this degree of isolation. And that's what's happening now.
Yes.
And people don't know how to connect. So unless you have a really powerful, loving family, just having a family doesn't count. It has to be a loving family. Or you have a faith. And this is where spiritual centeredness becomes key. Either of those two help people through those kind of troubled times. If you don't have a family, then at least if you have a circle of very close friends, what I would call a social identity group, not just friends, but the kind of people you really enjoy just being with. Without one of those three things, how do you step outside of yourself? So it is not surprising to me that COVID made the other pandemic, narcissism, worse. And narcissism was being fed all over the world in every culture. I mean, the example I used in one of the books was, I said, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? Today, yeah. I mean, today people my wife and I would go to all these great places on Greek islands or parts of Spain or, other countries of the world. And do people stop and appreciate, things at Angkor Wat or things in Thailand? No. They right away put their phone and they try to take a selfie of them being there. So the narcissism, I think, was aggravated tremendously by the COVID experience. So, and we've got a real human crisis going on. Sorry, you didn't ask me about that, but I just...
No, it's okay. It's perfect.
It's perfect. It's
yeah,
perfect.
yeah.
As say in Italiano, mi dispiace.
I resonate a lot with all these thoughts that you are sharing. And you mentioned before the when you post the intentional change theory, and in fact, you mentioned in this theory the importance of the ideal self.
Yes.
As a starting point of an authentic change. And so, taking into account all what you have been sharing in these minutes, what do you think? How can leaders reconnect with this vision of self when they feel maybe that they're emotionally disconnected or lost, or they don't find a way how to make it better?
Let me clarify one point, and just in case it's a translation issue, Maria.
Mm-hmm.
What I've said in my latest book and all of this research that's been showing it is that a person's sense of vision, your sense of purpose, the ideal self, is the motivator of sustained change. You use the word authentic change. It may or may not be authentic, but what I'm saying is the key is that it will continue more than a few months.
Okay.
And that's a very subtle thing, because a lot of people, New Year's Eve say, I want to become fit. You join a health club, you go for 2 weeks and you stop. That it's the sustainability that's the challenge. Now, what does vision do? A lot of people, especially in organizations and in management or leadership positions, bought the, we would call it the Kool-Aid, which is the manipulation of Tom Jones in Guyana when he got all of his followers to commit suicide. They drank the Kool-Aid, which he had laced with deadly poison. So that's where the expression comes up. People drank the Kool-Aid that goal setting was the key. And in my book, I talk about some of the history as to why in the 60s and 70s that became so popular. Today, if you're to pass the coaching certification exams, you have to agree that at the beginning of every coaching session, you should set specific objectives. Well, our studies show that that's wrong. It's wrong, because when you set specific goals at the beginning of a process, boom, you put blinders on. You're focused on that thing. That's the point of a goal. A goal is to get you to focus. Well, if it's early in the process, how do you know you're focusing on the correct thing? So it turns out that neurologically, and I don't know how much of this research you've followed in your own work, but every time you stimulate a specific goal, you activate the frontal parietal control network, which is really the network that helps instrumental behavior. Well, that network can activate the task positive network or the default mode. It could go either way. So the question is, which way does it go? Now, in organizations, we not only get people to set goals, but we do it with a fist. We do it to say, this will motivate people. Get a goal, get off your ass, work harder, focus. Well, what that does is stimulates the task positive network, which stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, our stress response, which closes us down. So now we're trying to work harder, but we're less open to new ideas or people. So the dilemma is, goal setting is useful late in the change process. Like I would say about 80% of the way. But during the opening parts, or if you're trying to motivate a group of people in an organization to innovate, you don't innovate when you're too focused.
Yeah.
You innovate when you're looking at all the possibilities. So the ideal self, or in teams or in organizations or even communities or countries, the shared vision ends up being the one thing, well, it's one of two things you can do that stimulate the default mode and the parasympathetic nervous system to help people be open. So what it means is, if you have a sense of purpose, not, we're going to, well, let's say for you, how much does it motivate you to say, we want to have another 10,000 subscribers to our digital magazine, versus we'd like to explore sense of well-being.
Yeah.
We'd like to help people discover or rediscover loving their family. That's exciting.
Yeah.
And if you do that, well, you'll get another 10,000 people. So this this issue of the dream, the sense of purpose, has a number of quirks that bother people in business organizations or even government. And that is that it seems not focused, because it's focused on a different thing. It's focused on a big picture. Why? Why are we worried about this? I mean, yeah, we want to make money in this business. Why do we want to make money in this business? So the issue of the dream, the vision, is it does invoke hope. And hope is one of those really strong, positive emotions. The other thing besides vision is being a part of compassionate relationships, caring relationships. Does that mean you have to be a social worker with everybody you work with? No. But you should know their dreams. You should be tuned in if they're feeling bad. It doesn't mean you have to wallow in it with them, but you should at least be sensitive to the fact that sometimes your friend or colleague is having a bad hair day, and say, okay. Or they're sad about something. So right now, I think what we know, and I say right now because there may be other, but right now the core emotion of hope and the core emotion of caring are two things that leap outside of this narcissistic, self-centered box to allow you to open up. And in that opening up, I think you find meaning. And if there's anything that today, the younger people entering the workforce, the Gen Zs, they're saying, look, I may not be able to make as much money as my parents, but I don't want to live the same lifestyle they did. I don't want to get divorced. I don't want to be sick because I can't stay fit. And by the way, I don't want to just make shoes for the sake of making shoes. I'd like to have some meaning to what I'm doing.
Yes, it's more clever. People is more centered on feeling better and well-being. I think that we have to learn from young people a lot. And so also all this that you have been sharing makes me think about this idea of positive emotional attractor and negative emotional attractor. And so
what about that?
What about that? And how these attractors influence the effective leadership? I think
there are two states.
Yeah.
One is the what I call the positive emotional attractor is arousing the parasympathetic, the renewal system, versus the negative emotional attractor is the stress system. In the positive emotional attractor, you're activating the default mode network, among other networks in the brain. In the negative emotional attractor, you're activating the task positive network. When people are doing those things, they tend to use positive affect adjectives for the PEA and negative for the NEA. The key is you need both. We have to have both in life. I mean, for example, if you didn't have a moment of this negative emotional attractor, you wouldn't have woken up this morning. To wake up consciously, your body has to activate. And it has to, if you were driving to work and all of a sudden somebody cut in front of you, the speed of you steering or hitting the brake requires the negative emotional attractor. If you are running into a financial problem, you have to look at the income, expenses, and say, how am I going to adjust this? You have to analyze that. You need the negative emotional attractor. So the thing is, we need the negative emotional attractor. It's useful and important, but it's not healthy.
And it's not the only way.
Right. Well, very often it is the only way. I mean, I'm very technical. My wife likes to say I'm still a nerd. And my ability to focus has always been, even from the time I was a kid. I mean, I can have all sorts of things going on around me, and I can be so focused that I just tune it out. My wife complains I also tune out her when too often, but and my dogs feel the same way. I tune them up, but so it does help me get stuff done. The problem is that if you live in that zone, it's kind of fatiguing and lonely. Now, the positive emotional attractor helps you be open to people and ideas. It helps you to renew and literally helps you feel elated or lifted. The problem is you can't live there all the time because sometimes you have to get stuff done. And if you lived in the PEA all the time, you'd probably levitate. But the key then is, how do we use these? Well, before you use it, you first have to be aware of it. The problem is we have some traits or dispositions that will push us one way or another. So if you're an optimist, you like the positive emotional attractor. If you're a pessimist, you like the negative emotional attractor. So there's some, and organizations, every organization tends to push us toward the negative. And yet, when you think of spiritual and really enlightened leaders, I mean, the great example is Martin Luther King, you know, on the National Mall in the US in 1963. He said, "I have a dream." He didn't say, "I have a nightmare." And of course, he was battling one of the most nightmarish conditions going on at the time. But he took the positive. You know, Gandhi did the same thing. Indira Gandhi did the same thing. You know, these are amazing feats of people rising above. And I think it's because what they're doing is they're stimulating the positive emotional attractor. So we need these tipping points to help us move along the process of change. And because the default is to be defensive, which is important to survive, and the organizational pressures are to be defensive, you have to reintroduce this PEA multiple times a day. Otherwise, you're exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you get home at the end of the day and you don't even have the energy to pour a glass of red wine, you know, from the Mendoza Valley, you know, or something. So that's not living either. And we now know that that's also not the recipe for innovation. Mm-hmm. So we need a positive emotional attractor to help us open up, to renew, not just for sense of well-being, but to innovate, to understand, to be open, to listen to your customers, to listen to your employees, to listen to your partners and your family, to your children. But all the pressures on us every day are to move toward the NEA for understandable reasons. So we published a series of studies just a few years ago showing, finally, with data, that the more moments you spend during a whole week in the PEA compared to the moments in the NEA or the stress predict sense of well-being, career satisfaction, life satisfaction, engagement, resilience, more empathy felt, more empathy demonstrated, less anxiety, less depression. We also showed, which was a little bit of a surprise to us, that the variety of things you used in a week to stimulate the positive emotional attractor predicted all of those things just as strongly. Mm-hmm. So that the variety of things you did to get there. So if you only meditated, it would be okay, but not, it would have trouble sustaining the potency. So variety ends up being important of ways to stimulate what I call the renewal or the positive emotional attraction.
And meditation is the most common and indicated way. Which other, as you mentioned, other ways?
Well, also exercise, and in some of our cultures, prayer. But again, I remember saying in the 70s to the patients I had, you know, if you stop drinking but you start smoking cigarettes, 3 packs a day, that's not going to be good for you. Or if you stop drinking and you start working out 6 hours a day, That's not going to be good for you. So what you have to worry about is positive addiction. I mean, it looks like it's positive, but you're just doing it too much. So the PEA is necessary to help you move along the process of change, but it's also necessary while you're in it to periodically get a dose. And the role of a manager, a leader, a consultant, a therapist, a coach, a parent is to reintroduce moments of PEA. They don't have to be a long time. You know, even 5 minutes. Turns out laughter and playfulness is that. So how many times have you been in work meetings where everybody is so damn serious? And you're saying, oh my God. So, you know, periodically, I like to say something that gets people to laugh. I'm doing it just to help break this, you know, heaviness, but also because that's the only way we're going to step out of it.